You're listening to Collected, stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr.
Confiscated Nazi newsreel films show 12-ton V-2 rocket bombs just after leaving their launching platforms. Reaching a speed of 3,000 miles an hour, the rocket climbs vertically for 60 miles before beginning its descent. It's been known to reach England 5 minutes after launching from the Netherlands over 200 miles away.
The German V-2 rockets, developed during World War II, marked a new scientific era. The technology used to make them eventually helped put astronauts on the moon. But these Nazi weapons are also a horrifying symbol of the Holocaust. They were built by slave labourers, concentration camp inmates, in appalling conditions underground. The memorial has a V-2 rocket in its collection. It's one of the few still in existence. And, as we'll hear later, the memorial also has the recorded testimony of a prisoner who survived the brutal regime and eventually made his home in Australia.
When you are so used to death that you don't think of it, but you could be dead tomorrow, easy.
Well, we're standing at the moment in the workshop of the Australian War Memorial's Treloar Annex. It's the big workshop with cranes overhead and machine tools and guys machining stuff. And what we've got in front of us is a German V-2 ballistic missile disassembled.
Shane Casey is a senior curator of military heraldry and technology. Part of the rocket we're looking at here is lying on a massive 14-metre-long trailer, which also holds two huge fuel tanks, one for liquid oxygen, one for alcohol. Shane and I are standing next to the V-2's main motor. It's upright, about 4 metres tall.
It's got a combustion chamber, which is about 2 metres high, and then a whole bunch of pipes leading into it from the fuel tanks above.
Some of which are coloured blue, some are green, some have got yellow stripes on them, and wires kind of dangling out down the bottom. Yeah. And then over to our right, Shane, what's that bit?
So over to our right is the main tail assembly of the rocket with its 4 big fins, and that slots over the main motor. Now, Louise, you mentioned the paint on the motor. That's actually original to 1945, and that actually helps us to date a lot of photographs from the period, because this was painted by the British after they captured the rocket, and it was used as a sort of an instructional tool for them so that they know, for example, the blue pipes leading into it are oxygen pipes, and other pipes, the brown ones, are alcohol pipes, for example. The British did this when they were assembling rockets after the war, and luckily, even though the photographs are black and white, we can see exactly the same patterns on some of those photographs, and we were able to say, yep, that's our rocket.
What is the significance of this V-2 missile? How was it developed and how was it used by the Germans?
That's a big question. The V-2 was the world's first strategic ballistic missile. It was developed by the Germans in the lead up to the Second World War and during the Second World War. Germany was forbidden from long-range artillery weapons under the Treaty of Versailles, and so they saw a little opening there, a loophole, and they started developing rocketry. Now, in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, there was a big civilian rocketry movement, and movies, for example, promoting humanity's reach for the stars were the big thing.
The scientists who worked on it may have dreamt of space exploration, but the V-2 was developed by the German military as a weapon, originally on a remote island in the country's north. At the time, Peenemünde was the world's most sophisticated rocket test facility.
From the start of production, which was 1943, the Germans ended up making around about 5,200 of these rockets, and they ended up firing about 3,000 of them, as far as we can work out.
So give us an idea of their range and the damage, the destruction they could cause.
Yeah. The range was around about 300 kilometres, which I suppose doesn't seem much these days.
But back then
it was amazing, and they would typically fire them from the Hook of Holland, the north coast around the Hague, over the Channel to London, or from the same area into Antwerp. They were the main two target areas, and roughly about the same, 1,500-ish on both those targets. A smattering on French targets, around about 70, and a few on German targets themselves, the Remagen Bridge across the Rhine. So these things are fired vertically. They're under power for about 65 seconds, and after 65 seconds the fuel cuts out and they just enter into a parabolic trajectory, unpowered, and then come in from basically low outer space at 5 times the speed of sound with devastating results. The rockets, it weighs around about 12 tonnes full, but by the time all the fuel's expended, you might be looking at about 3 tonnes, but it's coming down at sort of, super, super fast. 3 times the speed of sound it's hitting the ground at. And the kinetic energy alone of something like that hitting a city block would knock down the city block. So we have a number of examples where a rocket hit a building, let's say. The Spitalfields Market in London is a good example, and a Woolworths in London. One hit a cinema in Antwerp, killed 560 people. It was a freak accident when you had a massive death toll like that, because you have to have a concentration of people as well. Many of them would land in fields.
So how accurate were they, Shane?
The Germans were increasing their accuracy towards the end. Over that range, 300 kilometres, they were able to get within about 3 to 4 kilometres of the target. But, narrowing that down and improving all the time.
What sort of sound did they make as they came down?
Well, it's difficult to imagine what sort of sound they made, but witnesses described 2 booms. You have a sonic boom and you have the boom of the actual explosion, and then a few seconds later they heard this amazing rush of air, like the sound of an express train going through the air. So really 3 sounds. And apparently, if you were on a high part of London, you could hear these 3 sounds very clearly.
And how much warning did people get that one was about to hit them?
You didn't have any warning at all. It was just bam, instantaneous. And in London newspapers and letters and things of the time, there's a lot of discussion as to whether this was more scary and fearsome or the earlier V1 doodlebugs. And they were the ones that only travelled at about 450 kilometres an hour, but you could actually see them and hear them, and that was apparently scary because people conceived of those as robots and otherworldly. These things, the V2, it just appeared out of nowhere, and bam, suddenly there was a city block missing.
The Allies became aware of the possible existence of the V2s in 1939 from leaked German intelligence sources. But they didn't see photographic evidence until early 1943.
And in August 1943, Bomber Command, the RAF's Bomber Command, launched a massive attack on Peenemünde to try to kill the scientists working there and to wipe out the centre. On that particular raid, 17th of August 1943, a huge number of Australians were involved, including 460 Squadron, for example, and the Australian War Memorial has a Lancaster bomber that actually took part in that raid.
That was G for George?
G for George, yeah. And we know of 10 Australians who were killed on that raid around Peenemünde and the Danish islands on the way back. So that was one method that the Allies took to try to bomb their production sites. They also tried to bomb fuel supply depots, marshalling yards, and in late 1944, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force created a fighter wing, which was 2 fighter squadrons combined with the sole intent of sweeping across Europe, going to Holland and Germany and attacking the launch sites of the V2s. And they were very successful in dropping bombs on these sorts of areas. Now, they had to be careful, though, because these things could be launched from a very small area. We're standing in a little workshop at the moment, which is sort of, call it 50 metres by 50 metres. You could launch from that sort of an area within a forest or within a built-up area. And the Germans were very careful to try to launch from civilian areas. So you couldn't just flatten the area with bombers. It had to be precision targets. So there's not known to be any instance of a V2 launch being prevented from taking off. But Allied air crew did see them being launched and did stop railway wagons loading them and that sort of thing.
I suppose the Allies were just really lucky that the war ended before the Germans had made further advancements on the development of the capability of these weapons.
Yes, in many respects, as with many German weapons of the Second World War, it was too little too late. And we know that the Germans invested massive amounts of money in this. They estimate around about $40 billion, which sort of double the price or the amount of money that the Americans spent on the atomic weapon. We also know that the Germans devoted huge amounts of research that could have been turned to, say, radar or anti-aircraft mechanisms that might have actually provided a better dividend. So in many respects, this weapon system worked in the Allies' favour in that it diverted so many resources, German resources, towards it. On the other hand, the Allies devoted enormous resources in trying to bomb the sites, and an awful lot of aircrew were killed.
Shane, how did the Australian War Memorial get the rocket, get one of these V2s, and also the wagon that was used to transport it?
Yeah. So very early on, during the V2 campaign, its existence was known here in Australia, and if you look on Trove, for example, the website, you'll find many Australian newspaper articles talking about these wonder weapons in 1944 and 45. So I think there was an appetite in Australia, a public appetite, to get one of these and to exhibit it. And one was brought out in early 1947 specifically for the War Memorial. And that went touring around Melbourne and the eastern seaboard, but it didn't end up with the War Memorial, and it ended up basically as a gate guardian at a military base and was pretty much destroyed. The second one was brought out for the RAF's use, and it went down to South Australia, and it was retained within the Royal Australian Air Force's inventory until the mid-50s, and then it was given to the Australian War Memorial. And that's the one we've got here now that we're looking at, and the wagon or the trailer that it's sitting on came out at the same time. And it's a very important and rare thing. There's only 3 of these in the world.
Only 3 of the trailers?
Yeah. And the trailer is the means by which the rocket was lifted up into the vertical position and then placed onto a little launch pad. And as we look at the trailer, you can see all these profusion of pipes running the length of it. Well, they're actually the main filler pipes for the rocket's fuel system, and then alongside the built into the body of the trailer, we also see ladders along the side, and that's because when it was in its upright position, the ground crew who had to make the rocket ready for launch would climb up those ladders and plug in electrical leads and so on. So it's a really, really technically advanced trailer system, and the company that makes it or made it is still in existence in Germany, Myla Kappa.
These were seen as some of the defining technologies of the Second World War.
David Pearson is also a senior curator at the memorial. He's been looking at just how the V2 rockets influenced the post-war arms and space race.
The use of these particular flying bombs, the V1 and V2, prompted the British to look at building ranges that they could actually test their weapons upon. One of the things they worked out was that they didn't have enough room in England, so they looked to Commonwealth countries to go and build test ranges. So they looked at places such as Canada and Australia. Australia was chosen because of the vast areas which we have, which are largely uninhabited, and they started building things like the Woomera Range. Originally, Woomera was 2,300 kilometres. It went from north of Adelaide to off the coast of Western Australia. And the current Woomera Range is about the size of England.
So what became of the German scientists who'd worked on the Nazis' weapons programs? Many of them left Europe for the United States, including Wernher von Braun, who helped design and develop the V2.
So von Braun went to the United States. He developed the Redstone missile from the V2, and he went on to actually develop the Saturn V, which was used to take the astronauts to the moon. And the Woomera range was used to test a lot of rockets. They launched 8 Redstone rockets. The Redstone rocket was a direct evolution of the V2. In fact, one of the Redstone rockets, out of the 8 that the US used on the range, was used to launch our first satellite into orbit from Woomera. That was in 1967. During the 1950s and 60s, the complex was the second busiest rocket range in the world next to Cape Canaveral. And between 1957 and 2007, over 518 launches were recorded from Woomera.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr.
The staggering thing about the V2 is that more people died making it than were killed by it.
Eleni Holloway is an assistant curator at the memorial. She's been researching the human toll of the V2 rockets.
So around 20,000 prisoners, forced labourers, perished at Dora producing the V2, whereas around under 3,000 civilians died from V2 bombing.
Mittelbau Dora was the name of the Nazi concentration camp that was set up in 1943 to supply slave labour from countries occupied by Germany. The inmates were forced to live and work in dreadful, inhumane conditions.
They just were not taken care of properly. They didn't receive enough food and they worked really long hours. So a normal shift would be 12 to 14 hours long. You'd either get the night or day shift and then that would swap every fortnight. Food consisted of very little. A piece of bread in the morning, if you were lucky, maybe a cup of tea, sort of ersatz tea, no lunch. So they'd be working all day. They would stop for a lunch break, but there was no lunch. And then dinner consisted of a soup, who knows what was in it, with a piece of bread, margarine if you were lucky, some jam if you were really lucky, and then occasionally a sausage made of horse meat. So they're doing extremely long hours on very little food. Over time, these prisoners are losing weight and becoming extremely weak. They're exposed to more disease, boils, that sort of thing. It becomes very apparent that there's kind of a finite number on these workers.
In October 2012, Eleni had the privilege of recording the story of Alexander Bartos, one of the prisoners forced to build the V2 rockets. He was a multilingual Hungarian Jew, born in Budapest in 1921. In 1943, after completing an apprenticeship as an electromechanic, Alex was conscripted into the Hungarian army and moved into the Labour Corps. It later came under the command of the SS. In late 1944, Alex arrived at the Dora camp.
Yeah, it was a real honour to sit down with Alex and his family. Up until 1998, he never spoke about it, but then his story just continued to sort of unravel. And I think what was really interesting about him is that, and he said this very clearly throughout his interview, is that his education and his high knowledge of languages really did help him survive, because he was able to connect with people, with German guards and foremen, and in the hospital at Dora he's able to connect with the French doctor who's actually a prisoner himself, and they help him in little ways. The German foreman gives him some canteen vouchers that he can use to get sauerkraut, anything to just get those little bits of extra food which can really make the difference. He would give him a piece of bread and an apple, and in the case of the French doctor, he pushed him in front of a fire so that his temperature reading would be higher, so that he would be able to access the hospital and recover and recuperate for a month. So those little moments really helped him, and people were always impressed by his knowledge of other language and his ability and his skill. And so they were happy to help him in the small ways that they could.
Here's Alex talking to Eleni about his work on the production line in the underground factory.
After a couple of days, I am marched to the tunnel, and I am, you don't do anything. You are just like lambs being driven and to do this, do that. So I'm going into the tunnel. I remember marching along the tunnel, the main tunnel, and my room, which is cut all in stone, is to the left. And then I was told to go in there. Somebody, they made me, that's your seat, you sit there. Then the German foreman, who is a free man but is working as a supervisor, is wearing a uniform, but he's not armed. But they wouldn't be armed because, they could be attacked by us any time. So they would have shown me what my job is. And the job was these two wires were coming in the motor, but somewhere else, that I was to put each wire to which point. And that's what they do. And then you were sitting in a line, a huge big room, and there is a bench going all along, you lie there, so I lean back and I get the motor that was done, something that broke behind me. I put those two wires in, and then I push it forward to the bloke who is sitting in front of me, who then takes it and he does some movement on it. And that's all I did, nothing else but those two wires for about 5 weeks.
Despite the danger, some prisoners working on the production lines began sabotaging the V2 rockets. This resulted in beatings and random executions.
So the French resistance were highly active in Dora. They had access to several radios and they were listening to everything that was happening. They knew about the D-Day landings, they knew about Paris being retaken, they had the BBC News on, and word spread throughout the camp when the British government said to prisoners working in the German armaments industry to start actively sabotaging the work that they were doing. I'm sure sabotage occurred prior to that, but things really stepped up after that announcement, but also after some very sickly prisoners arrived from Auschwitz, mostly Jewish, in sort of late 1944. Sabotage really increased, and so did the hangings and reprisals for that. So some days during their supposed lunch break, workers would be moved from the assembly lines into the main hall where they would witness these executions. People were selected at random, around sort of 6 to 12, randomly selected, accused of sabotaging the parts. They were chained up, a little piece of wood in the mouth with the wires going to the back of the head. They were mounted up onto a bar, and most of them died from their necks breaking. But it started to really increase in late 1944 as the Germans were becoming more and more desperate, and there were really high rates of failure with the rockets, and they were becoming increasingly frustrated by that. So things really did start to ramp up.
Alex was one of the saboteurs. He sometimes left loose wires in the part he was working on. Being forced to witness the executions did not deter him.
And then they left them down. About 10 minutes later, I think somebody supervising it, well, they all dead, and me and others are then ordered to take the body and put it in a cart. So I remember if I held their legs, they were still quite warm. I mean, they were not dead yet. And we put them on a cart, and the cart was then taken away to the crematorium, and we were marched back to our workplace. That was our lunch. Those people who were hanged every day were accused, well, spying, but there was no much spying, of sabotage, right? Now, it didn't matter whether you did the sabotage or you were caught. You wouldn't be caught because my 2 pieces of wires were there. You wouldn't be caught, but I don't know how they picked their people. And my chances of being hanged one day would be the same if I did my work correctly, or I also occasionally let the wire loose. We all knew that. So there was a very stupid system that you did not, by knowing that you have the same chance of being executed if you do something that if you don't, naturally you do.
Alex faced death on a number of occasions, including on a forced march and on a horror train journey from Dora to Bergen-Belsen.
I'm still very, very weak when we are in Belsen, because that train trip from Dora to Belsen, we were so crammed in those wagons that you couldn't sit. So can you imagine you are for 6 days, first of all you just stand and you have nothing to drink, nothing to eat. Then people start dying, so the dead are then pushed out of the wagons every time we stop somewhere, and by the time we get to Belsen you have enough room to sit. You know, that's life. And so I was helped by the French doctor, I was helped by my luck, I was helped that the parents did send me help, so I was, well, it's just all that. And in Belsen, by then, it was a matter of days at most, a couple of weeks, I would have died, same as many others, of the sheer starvation and physical situation. So,
Alex Bartos celebrated his 100th birthday in March 2021. At the time of the making of this podcast, he was still enjoying life with his family in Sydney. The War Memorial's V2 rocket is not currently on display, but Senior Curator Shane Casey says there are important reasons why it should be.
Number one is that there's a direct connection with Bomber Command and with the loss of Australian lives, and that's what we commemorate at the Australian War Memorial. So we've got that. And then we've got the fighter pilots from 451 and 453 Squadron, and we can make a connection there. We also make a connection with the Holocaust. This is a really visceral survivor of that program. And then we look at the technological significance of it as well. It is the world's first ballistic missile. The captured V2s were used by the Americans just after the war to do all sorts of atmospheric experimentation. And the very first photographs of Earth showing the curvature of the Earth were taken with one of these.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Marr. You can subscribe to the series by going to the Memorial's website or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.